We are at week 12 of the 2019 college football season, and what a weekend we had of college football last week. We had the game of the year, LSU and Alabama. LSU coming out on top 46-41, and we also had Minnesota shocking the college football world by upsetting number 4 Penn State 31-26. So the rankings tomorrow night, I think it's going to be really shuffled. I think it's going to be a lot of chaos because how bad does Alabama fall? Does Penn State stay in the top 10? Does Minnesota move into the top 10? And does LSU jump Ohio State for the number 1 spot? It's going to be a lot of chaos tomorrow night, and I will be back tomorrow night after the rankings are revealed to give my reaction to it. And while we're talking about rankings, I have my new top 10 right here. So there is going to be a little bit of debate and controversy probably between some of you, but here's what my rankings are. At number 1, I have the LSU Tigers. The LSU Tigers picked up their 4th signature win of the season by beating Alabama in Tuscaloosa, which not only is that a big win, but it is a very convincing win to go on the road against Alabama, which had a very big home win streak. It was 30 something in a row, probably 31, 33. Either way, doesn't matter. That streak is now at 0. To end a long streak like that, it's a huge resume builder for LSU. And it's going to be interesting, as I covered just a moment ago. Will the committee bump LSU to that number 1 spot? Which I think it's the best thing to do. Considering number 2 Ohio State, I think Ohio State should at least be at number 2. I shouldn't expect Ohio State to go down to 3 at all. Because Ohio State, I think they're a much better team than Clemson right now. Ohio State, they have signature wins. But Ohio State's 2 signature wins, which right now, the 2 signature wins that are sticking out at this point are Cincinnati and Indiana. Because Indiana, they got into the top 25 AP poll. And I know the AP poll isn't something that we look at this time in the season, but it's important to know that Indiana is in that AP top 25 because you never know. Maybe the committee will put Indiana right at 24 or 25 because the committee rankings are always going to look a lot different than what the Associated Press rankings are. And despite Ohio State looking like a complete dominant team, leading the nation in scoring offense and scoring defense, Ohio State's 2 signature wins, they can't match up in quantity and quality compared to LSU's 4 signature wins. Because LSU's 4 signature wins are against Texas, Florida, Auburn, and Alabama. And 2 of them are on the road. So those 4 signature wins, they can't outweigh, in my mind, Ohio State's signature wins so far. At number 3, I have the Clemson Tigers. And Clemson, despite being ranked number 5, a lot of people thought it was a little bit controversial to put Clemson at number 5 in the original ranking. But Clemson, they just got to keep minding their business. They got to keep going with their business, and they're going to be in that top 4. But a Clemson slip-up is going to be huge for the teams in 4 through 10, especially with who I have at 4. And at number 4, I have the Alabama Crimson Tide. And this is probably what's going to spark a debate here. But you got to look at 5, 6, 7, and 8. You have to look at those 4. Because at 5, I have Georgia. 6, I have Oregon. 7, I have Oklahoma. 8, I have Utah. So those 4, from 5 through 8, you got to look at who has the best one loss at this point. Because right now, at the bare minimum, we are going to get at least one one-loss team in the college football playoff at this point. Because even if Minnesota wins out, they're still going to have to play a potentially undefeated Ohio State in the Big Ten Championship. So it's quite possible that we are going to get at least one one-loss team in this college football playoff. Because I'm not quite sure what to think about Baylor right now. Because Baylor, they have been skating by the skin of their teeth these last 2 weeks against West Virginia and TCU. And they also got by Texas Tech a few weeks ago. So Baylor, they could easily have maybe 3 losses this season, depending on how you want to look at it. Although, when you think about it, the year that Clemson won the national championship in 2016 with Deshaun Watson, they could have easily lost possibly 3-4 games. Auburn, when they made the national championship in 2013, they could have easily lost 2, 3, 4 games. Notre Dame, when they made the national championship, they could have easily lost multiple games. So it really depends on how you want to look at it. But Alabama's 1 loss, I think, is a lot better than Georgia's 1 loss. Well, definitely better than Georgia's 1 loss. I think it's better than Oregon's 1 loss. It's definitely better than Oklahoma's 1 loss. And it is definitely better than Utah's 1 loss. So I think that is probably going to be how the committee views that. If I had to make a prediction, I'm going to say that's going to be the exact top 4. I think the committee, they're going to jump LSU into that number 1 slot while knocking Ohio State down to number 2, which Ohio State stepped up last week without Chase Young against Maryland. But it is just Maryland, and Maryland has been a struggling team since week 3. So I think that'll be the exact top 4. The question is, will they put Georgia at 5? Will they put Oregon at 5? Or will they shock everybody and put Minnesota at number 5? But Georgia's 1 loss against South Carolina. I feel like at this point, ever since Georgia lost to South Carolina, I feel like that is a mulligan for the Bulldogs right now. Although Georgia has a big test this week on the road against Auburn. So, Georgia at 5, I think it's the right thing for them to be right now, because I think right now this South Carolina loss, I think it's a mulligan at this point. And Oregon at number 6, they could have easily lost either against Washington or Washington State. So Oregon at number 6, I feel like if they win out, there could be an argument between getting them into the college football playoff as the 1-loss team or Alabama. But I feel like a Clemson loss is going to be beneficial for everybody in 4 through 8. So that's going to be huge for them. Number 7, Oklahoma. They could have lost to Iowa State, and they almost did. Arguably, maybe should have. But just allowing Iowa State to come back in that game, I don't know. The Sooners, I feel like they might be in trouble this week. Number 8, Utah. I feel like they're right there at number 8. I feel like they could be on the outside looking in. I just don't know if Utah is going to do enough in the committee's eyes if they win out compared to an LSU team that could end up losing in the SEC championship game, or even an Alabama whose only loss is to LSU by 5 points. At number 9, I have Baylor. I kind of had to bump them down a notch because they almost lost a second consecutive game. They could have easily lost at least 3 games at this point. And at number 10, welcome to the top 10, Minnesota. Minnesota shocking the college football world by upsetting Penn State. Minnesota better be in the top 10 when the rankings are revealed tomorrow. So let's get to the Week 12 college football predictions. We begin with a battle of the Michigans. Michigan State and Michigan. This is a in-state rivalry, battle of the Michigans. And Michigan State, what can I really say about Michigan State at this point? Allowing Illinois to come back and beat you. Illinois out of all teams. Which, props to Illinois. I mean, what a season for them. They've beaten Wisconsin and Michigan State in the same season, which is pretty impressive. And they played their hearts out against Michigan earlier in the season. So Illinois football, I think it's taken a turn for the positive. But I'm going to take Michigan at this point because, I don't know, Mark D'Antonio's hot seat, it's up in flames right now, but can Mark D'Antonio extinguish it with what Michigan State has left in the season? I'm taking the Wolverines because I really don't know if I can take Michigan State seriously at this point. Next, we've got Minnesota and Iowa. Minnesota is coming off a very emotional win. Not really an emotional win necessarily. It was an emotional win, but the biggest win in program history. That is what they're coming off of. And now they go on the road against Iowa, which is a very tough place to play. And this one, I really don't know who to pick because Iowa, they haven't done well against ranked opponents this season. But I think with Minnesota coming off an emotional victory against Penn State last week, I think Iowa's going to look for redemption this week, and I think they're going to pull off the upset against Minnesota. And I think Minnesota's stay in the top 10 will unfortunately be a short one. But I would like to see Minnesota win because I want to see some parity in college football. I think it would be very big to see Minnesota in a major bowl game. Even if Minnesota wins out but loses the Big Ten championship, it's going to be exciting to see those Golden Gophers in the Rose Bowl. But I do think Iowa will win this week. Next, we have Florida and Missouri. Missouri is trying to recover from an abysmal performance against Georgia last week, while Florida, they are not mathematically or theoretically out of the SEC East. Georgia could lose twice. You just never know in this day and age in college football. But I do think Florida's going to have some issues in this game. One, because of the weather conditions. We're in November, so it is pretty cold in the Midwest. But I do think Florida survives in this one. I think it's going to be much closer than anticipated. I think the Gators win a close one. They're going to skate by in this one with a 23-21 victory. I think Florida's defense is going to step up late in the game, get a turnover to seal the deal for the Gators on Saturday. Next, we've got Wake Forest and Clemson, and this matchup, there's no hype to it anymore. With Wake Forest's abysmal performance against Virginia Tech last week, this could have been a chance for Clemson to get some resume points, just in case there is that slight chance that they do slip up later in the season. They can still have a ranked win over a Wake Forest team to back it up, to at least give them an argument that they have a convincing win. But there's no excitement to this matchup anymore because Wake Forest played terrible last week. And Wake Forest is going to play terrible again. I'm taking the Tigers. Blowout? Probably. Because Clemson has just dominated everyone that they've played ever since that, I think, a fluke performance against North Carolina. Every team is going to have that one game, or they have to fight to win. And every team has to go through it. If you want to be a national champion, you've got to survive a close game. Next, we have Texas and Iowa State, a very underrated matchup in the Big 12 this week. Texas is coming off a win against Kansas State, while Iowa State, they did all they could to come back against Oklahoma. They probably could have and maybe should have, depending on how you want to look at things. They just couldn't get enough turnovers against that Oklahoma offense. But this is going to be a big matchup. I'm going to take the Longhorns, though. I think the Longhorns, they're trying to salvage what is left of their season, get to a decent bowl game, end the season on a positive note, and look forward to 2020. So I'm going to take the Longhorns in this one. I'm going to say it's going to be a shootout, though. Brock Purdy, I think, is going to make enough plays to keep Iowa State in this game from start to finish. But in the end, though, I think Texas wins in a shootout 45-42. Next, South Carolina and Texas A&M. Every time that I pick Texas A&M, they don't seem to do very well. And when I don't pick them, they sometimes surprise me and win. South Carolina's high moment of the season was upsetting Georgia on the road. But unfortunately, Will Muschamp is on the hot seat right now. I don't know if that win against Georgia a few weeks ago is going to save Will Muschamp at this point. I'm going to take Texas A&M because ever since that win against Georgia, South Carolina just hasn't looked productive at all in the football field. So I'm taking the Aggies. Next, we have Arizona and Oregon. Oregon, if they take care of their business, they could be one of those 4 teams that could get in the college football playoff. But I think the Ducks are going to win. But as I covered a few weeks ago, Oregon has been surviving a couple games. And one of these times, Oregon just won't be able to survive. Oregon, you can argue they should be undefeated right now. They were leading against Auburn for almost the entire game except for the last 9 seconds. You could argue and say Oregon could be ahead of Georgia in the rankings. But the way I see it, I think at this point Georgia has a much better resume to me than Oregon has. So I'm going to take the Ducks in this one. But I think the Ducks, they need to watch their back later on in the season. Whether if it's going to be against Arizona State later on in the season or the Pac-12 championship. I feel like Oregon is going to lose either to Arizona State or in that Pac-12 championship game to Utah. I think one of those games Oregon's going to lose and go down and eliminate their college football playoff hopes. But the Ducks will win this week. Next we have Navy and Notre Dame. This is going to be an exciting one. I do think the pace of the game is going to favor Navy. However, I think eventually Notre Dame is going to be able to stop this triple option for Navy, and I think Notre Dame will win this game. Convincingly, I'm not quite sure because Navy, they're not a team to take lightly, especially this season because they are in that group of 5 race. Navy has now entered the race for that New Year's 6 bid. But I'm going to take Notre Dame this week. Next, a big battle in Jordan-Hare, Georgia and Auburn. And this game, I think, is probably going to be the best game of the week. Even though Oklahoma and Baylor is the game that College Game Day is going to, I still feel like this is going to be the game of the week. Because I feel like we're in the same position where we were in 2017. Where Auburn is a 2-loss team, but their 2 losses are to very, very good teams. And right now, Auburn's 2 losses are to Florida, and they are to LSU. The question is, if Auburn wins out, would they have a chance to get to the college football playoff? In 2017, it was if they won the SEC championship, they'd get in. But this time around, 2 years later, in 2019, it seems like a very long shot at this point. I think the only way that Auburn would get into the college football playoff is if everyone in front of them lost. Like literally everybody in front of them. Which everyone in front of them could easily lose because someone's going to lose between Oklahoma and Baylor this week, depending on how the committee ranks these teams. Because that's going to be a big factor in that. But right now, I'd say Auburn's chances of the college football playoff are probably at about 2%. Especially if they can win out, they'd get convincing victories over Georgia and Alabama. So it would be a long shot at this point. But I think the best case scenario for Auburn would be to take care of your business the rest of the season. Hope that Florida potentially slips up at some point at the end of the season. And hope that LSU finishes 13-0. And also hope that Penn State beats Ohio State and the Big Ten champion is going to have 2 losses. That is your best hope. And hope that Oregon will slip up, but then come back around and give Utah their 2nd loss in the Pac-12 championship. That's your best hope to have all these 2-loss teams. Because then it's about who's the best 2-loss team in college football. Which, that is a big scenario that we could get into tomorrow night, but it'll probably be a lot of time to explain. But anyway, 2 years ago, Georgia was the number one team in college football. They were number one to the College Football Playoff Committee, while Auburn was sitting with 2 losses. And Auburn just completely dismantles and dominates Georgia. And right now, 2 years later, I think the same thing's going to happen. We are in November. It's time to start picking some upsets. I regret not picking upsets last week, so I'm going to go ahead and pick an upset right now. I'm going with Auburn to pull off the upset against Georgia, ending the Bulldogs' playoff hopes and giving Florida a glimmer of hope to get to the SEC championship game. So I'm taking Auburn to pull off an upset against Georgia. I feel like there's always going to be that game where Jake Fromm is off. You could say he had that against South Carolina, but I think this is going to be a huge challenge for the Bulldogs. I think they're going to use the home crowd to their advantage in Jordan-Hare. I think they're going to run the football pretty well against Georgia. Despite Georgia having a good run defense, I think Auburn will be able to make the plays to win this game. I'm going with Auburn to pull off an upset. And finally, we have the game of the week, Oklahoma and Baylor. Huge showdown in Waco this weekend. Huge college football playoff implications are on the line here. Baylor, they could have about 2 or 3 losses this season. But Baylor has beaten some pretty good teams this season. Doesn't really matter what the rankings are. I feel like Baylor has a good resume at this point. And they can build up their resume even bigger by beating Oklahoma. And Oklahoma, they could have lost to Iowa State last week. Maybe should have. As I've covered already in this podcast a couple times already. The way I see this, though, this is almost like the same thing that we saw in 2017 and last year, where Oklahoma, they lose a game early in the season, but then after it, they play a pretty close game. But then Oklahoma, they dominate the further on the season goes, and we find them in the college football playoff. And I think this is history repeating itself for the 3rd consecutive year. I think Oklahoma, they had their mulligan already this season. Then they came off that loss and they played a close game the next week. And the script stays the same. It's just a different season, different quarterback. I think the Sooners win this one. I think Baylor is going to get a huge reality check this week. And I think Oklahoma wins by, at the minimum, 10 to 14 points. I'm taking the Sooners by 2 possessions in this one. I just think it's reality check time for Baylor. So those are my Week 12 college football predictions. Like, share, subscribe. And I will see you tomorrow night for my reaction to the new college football playoff rankings. We're going to react to the rankings. We're going to compare my rankings to theirs. It's going to be a good one. We'll also go over some potential scenarios, including how many teams are really still in the hunt for the college football playoff. Right now, the way I see it, we got maybe 10 to 12 teams fighting for 4 spots. So it's going to be interesting. I'm going to come up with some scenarios for tomorrow, and then we're going to discuss them. So it's going to be a pretty interesting one. Be sure to tune in, and I will see you tomorrow night.